Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am your host, Steve Bisa. I'm an author and mental health counselor. Are you curious about therapy? Do you feel there is a lot of mystery about therapy? Do you wonder what your therapist is doing and why? The goal of this podcast is to make therapy and psychology accessible to all by using real language and straight-to-the-point discussions. This podcast wants to remind you to take care of your mental health, just like you would your physical health. Therapy should not be intimidating. It should be a great way to better health. I will demystify what happens in counseling, discuss topics related to mental health, and discussions you can have with your therapist. I also want to introduce psychology in everyday life, as I feel most of our lives are enmeshed in psychology. I want to introduce the subtle and not so subtle ways psychology plays a factor in our lives. It will be my own mix of thoughts as well as special guests. So join me on this discovery of therapy and psychology. Hi, and welcome to episode 55 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am Steve Bisa. Please go listen to Pat Rice on episode 54. It was an amazing conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. But episode 55 will be with Cara, Tirrell, and Bill Dwinnells. Cara and Bill are returning guests. They came in season 2. One of the top downloaded shows so far in my 5-season career. But Cara and Bill will talk about emergency services, their own experiences. How can we help people in emergency services at this time and the different stressors that they have nowadays? Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 55 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy, and also episode 5 of the YouTube channel, Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am Steve Bisa. Joining us again after episode 21 and all the success, but unfortunately, you're number 3 right now. I'm just saying that. You got to work a little harder. After episode 21, we were number one, and then it started just dwindling. I mean, no pun intended. But I have Bill Dwinnells here and I have Cara Tirrell. We've talked about emergency service work in the past, and it was really fun. And I know a lot of people ask for them to come back. So here we are. So welcome, Bill. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I hope that we don't have the recording issue that we had on the last one. That's why we are all in separate places. None of this like fancy get in the same spot thing.
Right. It's good to see you guys virtually.
Yes, nice seeing you guys.
Well, we saw each other on Monday anyway. We were face to face which was really nice too. But yes, I think that it was really good to have that episode. I think a lot of people got a better glimpse of the work on emergency services. But in case someone missed episode 21, go back and listen to it. But still let's start with you, Bill. How about you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Bill Dwinnells. I am currently an emergency service director for one of the local teams. I've been doing emergency service work for about 26 years. Yeah, I cringe when I think about it.
That's a long time.
It's a very long time. Other than that, I can be found at my website, just my name, BillDwinnells.com. Yes, I'll kick it over to Cara.
Bill, you're not giving yourself enough credit. You have not only are the director after all that experience, you have your own private practice.
Yeah.
And you also created software that I think is cutting edge. So maybe you can put a plug in for that.
I do have software that we use for managing the emergency services programs. I think right now it's used in about half the teams in Massachusetts. And you can find that at 508tech.com if you're interested in that.
And we clearly could tell who is into marketing and who forgot about their marketing skills.
Yeah.
That's one thing we do learn as clinicians, to try to kick that in once we get into the private practice or starting our own business, which I have recently done. So I'm a year into a private practice, and Steve has helped me immensely. Bill has been a great mentor as well. I've had about a year of Cara P. Tirrell counseling.com. You can call me at 508-834-7742, or you can find me at CaraTirrellCounseling.com online for my website. But just like Bill and Steve, I had been in crisis work probably for over 20 years, 15 years at Advocates Psychiatric Emergency Services, where we all met and fell in love with crisis. And I've investigated elderly abuse for a couple of years at some different area council on agings and some community-based work as well.
So the quick math says that between us three, there's 61 years of experience on ES.
Wow.
Then
Sounds about right.
we're 4 years from now, Bill, you got to retire. That's what I got from that.
4 years. All right. I'll have to check my finances.
You'll be 65. I mean, that's a retirement. Oh, no, we're too young for that. It's 67. So you still got a few years. You're good.
Yeah.
Right.
Last time we talked about so many great subjects and people really were interested in ES work. And one of the things that people asked me, like they said, do you enjoy ES work? Did you like to do that stuff? And for me, it was always, I miss it, but I don't know if I would go back to it. And that's kind of my answer. But I want to throw it to both of you and see, like, because people really seem like they're like, you guys are enthused. You seem to be really enjoying it. But, maybe Bill's still in it, so might have a different answer. But how about you go first, Bill?
Well, I mean, I've been doing it for so long. I mean, clearly I love it. I really like doing emergency service work. It's very fast paced. There are no black and white answers. We always say that emergency services works in the gray. And that can be trying to figure out how to best serve the individual, or in some cases, families. What can we do to help these individuals or families move along? How do we help them navigate the system? Because the system itself isn't always very friendly. And if you don't kind of know where to go, who to talk to, or what to say, the truth of the matter is it can be very daunting. And these people are being asked to do this while they're having some sort of psychiatric or some sort of emergency. They need help. So I really like being able to be there. And now I'm in a director's position, so I'm guiding other clinicians on how to get people to where they need to be and to get them the services they need to be. And I think that's what's always really thrilled me about the job, is being able to do that, despite a lot of the frustrations and barriers that we come up against on unfortunately routine basis.
What about you, Cara? I know you've been out of it now for about a year, right?
Couple of years, yeah.
So how do you feel?
I would say similar to what you guys are saying is that there's something about being in a fast-paced environment. Every day every hour is different. When you're in the ER, you're talking to the doctors, the nurses, the police, clients, family, making calls to our psychiatrist to consult. It's very fast-paced. You do have to be organized. You have to have great time management. And I think it's something that if anybody coming into the field, no matter what they want to do, I would actually say this is probably the best place to start to learn almost everything. Diagnosing people, you're consulting, giving clinical information, you're transitioning people through their insurance, as well as determining level of care. So there's a lot of rich knowledge that goes along with it. You learn from everybody you work with. Everybody has different styles, but the commonality is that you can think on your feet. You like that action environment. If you want to process things for a long time, this is not the place for you. This is kind of making decisions, giving directives to the doctors, like we said, and they're looking to us for a lot of information and resources, and that can be daunting, but it also can be very exciting. So as much as I loved it, and I 15 years, like I said, and longer in the rape crisis world and domestic violence, and I really liked working with the people there and making connections with people. I don't know if I could go back either. It's tough. It's a lot of work, and Bill's still in it, so he knows.
Oh, and I think that what we were trying to do, me and Cara here, is to explain to Bill why we still love our work, but we may not want to do it for just what we used to do it for. Just saying, Bill.
I welcome both of you back to emergency services at any time. You have jobs waiting for you.
But I think it's important to think about all the stuff that we went through. So I remember one of the things that has really changed about since I worked on a crisis team, when people call me nowadays, if the phone calls more than 10 minutes, I feel like I got to hang up on them or call the police to tell them to go pick them up. I don't know if you've developed some of these things, but like it took me a long time to say, okay, yes, I can relax on the phone for 15 minutes and it's okay. Have you guys have developed some of these little quirks around in your life because of our emergency work?
I would say so. I think transitioning from, I did the crisis work along with working for the town for that 15 years. So I was still in that crisis mode, but dealing with people that was a more like you said, a casual, I don't say casual environment, but a different environment where it's not immediate crisis. So it's always hard not to go right to treatment or go right away to giving someone a resource and kind of sitting with what's going on. And then fast forward to being in private practice, that's a whole other skill set that you need to have. And what I kind of reassure myself about in that is that the crisis work we did makes us attuned to what to look for, how to assess someone very quickly, and then also to be able to give community resources, which I don't think a lot of private practice know about what's outside other than another therapist or a psychiatrist. But, I'm familiar with the food pantries in the area. I'm familiar with the emergency funds, the substance abuse prevention, treatment, things like that. So that has been an asset to going into this field.
Yeah, I think that getting all those community resources and the assessment of in a quick way is just something that we do. And we're not looking. One of the things that I also kind of love about the work we develop is I don't look for a diagnosis right away when I'm working with someone, looking for the quick one just to get it out of the way. So thank you, private insurances, to get me paid. But otherwise, after that, I actually do the real work, which may take a week or two, but at least you can do that in private practice. But I like the fact that people like, well, you came up with that quick. I'm like, yeah, because I don't want to waste my time on diagnosing. I just don't care about it.
Right. That's something that you've taught me, Steve. I think that's a big difference of being in the psych emergency world where you have a connection with having to provide a diagnosis because of the insurance. And also depending on what you think the person needs as level of care, you have to be able to provide the clinical to either kind of upgrade their need or even downsize their need. So you have to be able to do both of those things and advocate for your client.
Right. And the least restrictive,
Yeah.
Outcome. Bill, what about you? Have you developed any quirks because of your work in ES?
Well, the two of you know very well that I have plenty of quirks.
I thought we had an NDA on that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. Quirks that I've developed. I think probably one of the biggest quirks is I've been told that I underreact to things. Because in emergency services, we're used to hearing these wild, crazy, heartbreaking stories. People are just like, you're always so calm when they tell these stories. I'm like, because you can surprise me, but it's very hard to shock me at this point. I've had people say that. I agree that within 5 minutes of talking to you, I can diagnose you with some general thing that, okay, this is the general direction that we're probably going in. We'll have to work out the nuances of it later. But yeah, I mean, I would say that's probably one of the biggest ones. And I completely agree with Cara. And I know Steve has the same feeling that every single clinician coming out of grad school should do at least a year or two on an emergency service so that when they get to the point where they are calling for involuntary commitments, Massachusetts, it's called Section 12. I don't know if you have listeners outside of Massachusetts, but
He's internationally known.
Oh, he's internet. Oh, that's right. You got the.
I just need someone in South America. Now we'll hit every continent. So.
All right, but people who are going to be signing these involuntary commitments, they really need to understand what they're doing. Yeah. And they really need to understand what these papers say, because I think sometimes clinicians without that experience are very quick to sign these things and then get upset when the ES team lets them go.
Right. Because it is a powerful document, like you're saying, Bill.
Yeah.
I've seen so many times where I said it literally says on the Section 12, you can't section someone for substance abuse, and the police or someone else or a community member or a psychiatrist are sectioning, which means taking away someone's rights, really. And they have to be unable to make their own decisions, which still doesn't mean that you don't have to advocate for your client. That's what, when I worked with elderly, especially, or children or a vulnerable population, that's a big piece of that job. And to take that away without really understanding the document, like you said, is dangerous.
We'll have people call up and be like, well, why can't you just section them? And, I've worked with a lot of law enforcement over the years, and talking to them, this Section 12, this involuntary commitment, it's more powerful than an arrest warrant. Because even if the officer arrests you, they have to charge you with something in 24 hours or let you go. Okay. A Section 12, I can hold you 3 days and I don't even have to tell you why.
Yeah.
So there's that. So I think knowing that, because I don't want to take away anybody's civil liberties without a very clear cause, I think sometimes that might be what makes others in the field feel like I'm underreacting to stuff. It's like I can't issue a section for something I think they might do.
Yeah.
Just like I can't pre-arrest somebody because I think they're going to commit a crime.
We'd all be in handcuffs right now.
We'd all be in handcuffs.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah.
I'm speaking for you. That's a good point, Bill, is that it is hard to explain to someone who's not in the field or even in a different field why that just isn't on a whim or so, can be done. Like you said, if someone's concerned because someone's not eating and therefore that would cause they could die from that eventually. But that's really not what the crisis is. It has to be really an immediate safety issue.
Right.
And I think that what I would throw at you is like sometimes people jump to that Section 12 way too quickly.
Yeah.
And then some people underuse it also.
Yep.
And I had a conversation with someone. It's going to be on it was on episode 53. Go back, Jay Ball and Caitlin Dehe. Jay Ball works at the co-response in Framingham, Massachusetts. Caitlin works for Westboro Behavioral. I plugged them at the same time. But one of the things that we talked about in our last podcast was that how people are unwilling on a social work level to sign a Section 12, and they turn to the police and again, I'm not saying this about every police and every social worker, but some police have a high school diploma and they're like, oh no, we'll turn to your high school diploma who doesn't work with mental health to decide if there's a Section 12 here. And they were saying that's pretty unfair too.
Yeah.
And I figured I'd ask both of you. I thought it was a good point to make here.
I encourage any police department to call whoever their local emergency service provider is. Because one of the aspects of emergency services that I do think gets underutilized, especially for the police, is a consultative service. I mean, the Section 12 very clearly states, I have or have not consulted with the local ESP screening team. So if the police or any social worker or anybody who can sign the Section 12s has a question, call the ESP. All right. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to give you the answer you want. But at least then you've talked to somebody who, quite frankly, I mean, this is what we do all day, every day.
Yeah.
Me and my team, the other teams throughout Massachusetts, we know exactly what a Section 12 is. We know exactly what the criteria is and what doesn't meet criteria.
I'm going to stop you for a second. So let's pretend someone doesn't live in Massachusetts, doesn't know what a Section 12 is.
Yeah. Involuntary.
How would you describe it?
It's a paper for involuntary commitment. I know in was it California? I think they call them 5150s, right?
Right.
Also a very famous Van Halen album. But they've also been called pink papers, involuntary civil commitments.
Right.
Because they are on pink paper, just FYI.
Yeah.
And then
most of the time, unless it's copied.
Yep.
And then we talk about the three main criterias, which are danger to themselves, danger to others, or lacking judgment that will cause possible harm to themselves or others.
Okay, but let me amend that a little bit.
Well, that's kind of where I wanted to go. So you got the gist of what I was going for.
A little bit. It's very specifically suicidal, not they're going to hurt themselves.
Right.
Suicidal, homicidal. And both of these things have to be imminent. So if you tell me you're going to kill yourself next week, I cannot section you for that. Okay. If you're going to kill somebody else next week, I can't section you for that. I can report that to the police. That's a lamb warning. That's different. But I can't section you for it. And same thing with the psychosis. You have to be so psychotic that you are in, and again, the key word here is imminent danger, not just because you're psychotic. There are plenty of psychotic people wandering around in society today, 99% of which are not dangerous. They're psychotic, but they're not dangerous.
Yeah.
Cara, you want to make your point? I didn't know you were trying to say something.
I was going to say, just to clarify too, and when we're assessing for suicidality, I think a lot of Steve's work with some of the podcasts and the different treaters is talking about suicide suicidality as a baseline feeling, and talking about normalizing that and not going immediately to, pathologizing it or saying that you're immediately in crisis if you have those feelings. And the way we assess that, and Bill, you do it more recently, but we assess by finding out if someone has a plan. Is it something that they have access to? Do they have guns in their house? Do they have, swallowing a battery is not probably going to kill you, but you have the intent to do that. You have the plan to do that. And then we assess what the danger level is. So there's a couple different aspects as well. It's not that someone is suicidal and tells you, I want to kill myself. Those are, sometimes people have hopeless feelings. Sometimes people feel helpless, scared, but they would say, we talked about people, maybe somebody would say, well, I would never do that because I have 2 children, or I would never do that. It was very rare, I thought, in the years that I was at psych emergency services, that someone really had the intent and the plan to kill themselves. Yeah. That didn't mean people didn't say that, but there was few and far between it, whether I saw maybe a letter that was very specific, the hairs on the back of my neck, plus the clinical judgment. But I knew that person could not be safe at home. You just, again, right, with your instinct and assessing them.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point, Cara. If you're going to do emergency services, you need to understand that when the individual sits across from you and they say, I'm suicidal, I want to kill myself, that is the beginning of the conversation. It's not the end. You don't just sit there, oh, you're suicidal, okay, in the hospital you go. No, that, just like you said, Cara, that is where you start the conversation. It prompts other questions to determine plan, intent, and means, but also what's driving this? Is there something driving this that I can help mitigate? Is there a service out there that you don't know about, but I do, because that's my job, that I can connect you with that can help alleviate or mitigate these feelings? So I think that's what I like to remind, especially when I get new clinicians in, that just because they said they're suicidal, that doesn't mean the whole encounter stops right there and I put them in the hospital. That's where the encounter truly begins.
Right. And I think I'm going to say again, finding your way through therapy, Cara, Tirrell, Bill Dwinnells, we're talking about emergency service work and how it goes. One of the things that I also would add to that assessment of suicidality, I've said this multiple times, I'm going to say it again, you need to ask the right questions. So there's passive suicidality versus active suicidality. There's also, and the difference between the two is passive suicidality. If something happened to me, I wouldn't mind, or something like that, versus active, I'm seeking this mean by doing this thing in order to get to that end. That's more active. And it's also kind of like telling, truthfully, I've worked outpatient pretty much throughout my career since I started in 2003. You know how many people I've worked with that are passively suicidal, that are in the community, survived, and I've never done anything. I've never sectioned them. I've never done anything else around that. And I think that that's the other part that people don't understand about ES. My client says he's suicidal. What's the plan? Well, no plan. What are they going to do? They're not seeking it per se, but they don't want to live. Okay, well, I don't know if that meets criteria for something that we call Section 12 in Massachusetts. Or for me, I think maybe a good way to think about it, since this is more international, taking away civil liberties. Right. So I don't know what you guys think, but.
Good point. The other piece to talk about is also past history. And I think we should also talk about an important piece is if someone has a successful suicide, a completed suicide in their family, that also lends itself to a higher risk when you're assessing for something. If they've had past intent, if they've had made past self-harm, those things are all aspects that we have to assess. And just to your point, and I'm sure Bill's still doing this, when I used to go into the ER, I'd have a set route I went for. I'd always, find out who the referring person originally was, contact them, look at the medical reports, because that's the advantage of being in the ER, that someone has been medically cleared. Look at the substance use history, look at the contacts and collaterals that you need to contact. So doing those assessments beforehand gives you some more information so that when you do go in to meet with the client, you have some background information. So you do the assessment and then you follow up on more aspects of it. And sometimes if someone comes in where they're impaired or there's substance use and they made an original statement of wanting to hurt themselves, Well, 3 hours later, when they sober up, sometimes they say, I know I said that, but that was because of this, this, and this. Now I don't feel like that. And of course, we have to collaborate it. We have to make sure they're safe and those type of things. So it is really hard to explain to a layperson, yes, they are suicidal, but we're not going to place them in a hospital against their will.
Right.
So that's a really hard concept, I think, to talk about to a normal person.
I think a little, Steve, you can rein me back in if this is a little off track. But I think we talked about this in the last podcast we did, that there's still a lot of magical thinking about what an inpatient unit's going to do and what has to be done in an inpatient unit. We've seen countless times that the vast majority of services that you can get inpatient, you can get outpatient too. You don't necessarily need to be on an inpatient unit to get your meds looked at, to get some social services put in place. All the emergency teams in Massachusetts can connect you with a very wide variety of services, probably more than we really have time to go into here. But all my brothers and sisters who are still in emergency services, they have, not that you guys aren't my brother and sister, but
I was going to point that out, but I was going to wait.
They have a very wide variety of things that they can do. So, the goal really, it isn't that we don't want to put people inpatient. We don't want to put people inpatient who don't need to be. There is a section of the population that, they do need to be inpatient, and we'll take care of that. But not everybody who has a negative emotion needs to go into an inpatient unit.
Right.
Well, wouldn't that be the whole population, really?
Yes. I was just going to say normalizing all these different feelings, especially now. I couldn't imagine, I kudos to you, Bill, because I know it's a tough job right now. We had a tough job years ago, and I can't even imagine, the complications and how complex it is now. So I just remember how much it went into it. Never mind if it was a child and we'd have to make a DCF report, or it was an elder, we had to make an elder at risk report, or it was someone who might be vulnerable and have a disability. We'd have to make those reports as well while we're filling out another 12-page paper and trying to kind of get it all done within 2 hours, really, if that, because we have 7 more people waiting.
And I think it's a good shift to do too, because I would love to hear more about, again, Bill, you're the only one who's in it, but I certainly get reports from a whole lot of people. Since the pandemic, less beds available, more boarders in the ER, a lot of more acute stress and acute needs in the community. It really has shifted. It's always been kind of difficult, as Cara pointed out. We've seen it ourselves. But I would say that in the last 2.5 years, the acuity and the boarders in emergency rooms has gone significantly higher, particularly for mental health services. How is that shift kind of like, how did ES work? How have they dealt with that shift?
Well, the last 2 years have been extremely trying for the entire population, not just ES work. Things were complicated, obviously, because of COVID. So a lot of the community services that had been in place out of necessity had to shut down, either because their own staff were sick or because they just couldn't take the chance of infecting their staff. And even today, we're still seeing the results of that. I don't like to blame everything on COVID, but it did make a very huge impact. People weren't getting the services they needed, which then caused them to go into crisis. And then what's their first thought? Oh, I'm going to go to the ED. So now the ED gets overloaded. But the ED, I've said this numerous times before, if you want psychiatric assistance, the ED is not the place to go. And I have complete respect for everybody who works in the ED, the nurses, doctors, and so forth. This just isn't what they signed up for. They're there for medical things. There's some people there who are there for like psychiatric nursing and stuff like that. But even this isn't really what they do.
Right.
They're really just kind of a holding place until you move on to the next level of care. So when they start getting overwhelmed with folks like this, it becomes very difficult for them. As the emergency service team, I come in and we're trying to move people along the system, but the rest of the system has the same problem. Their staffing is down because of COVID. There's a staffing shortage across the board, all industries at this point. So I have friends who are intake directors at some of these hospitals, and they have physically, there are enough beds. They don't have the staff to open the unit, either because of COVID or they just can't hire. In some cases, there are empty beds, but there's no one to staff the unit. The beds that can be staffed, they're overwhelmed because every step of the system right now is bottlenecked. Once one person moves, it can move forward one space, but that's it. And the problem is you got well in the hundreds of people who are waiting for beds or placements at places. So that's the problem. What have we been doing to try to mitigate that? A lot of the ESs have been doing, the ESs and some of the inpatient units have been doing some really exciting out of the box thinking. We've seen a tremendous increase in the number of virtual partial programs where somebody can attend the partial program virtually. It's usually 9 to 1, 9 to 3, depending upon the program, where they can attend groups virtually. It's not as exciting as doing it in person, but because it's virtual, they can actually have more people. So they're actually able to service more people. And they can schedule time to meet with a doctor who can review their medications and do things like that. As both of you know, a lot of times people would be sitting in the ED with no treatment whatsoever until they got to the inpatient unit. One of the things that we've been able to do with one of the local hospitals is create a virtual partial program that they can start while they're in the ED. So the time they're spending in the ED is not wasted, untreated time.
Emergency departments can be overwhelmed. They probably like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's been fantastic. We've been making a lot more increases to emergency medication evaluations. We've been using, I can tell you, my team has been using crisis counseling a lot more. So we'll help you bridge if you know you're going to have an appointment with a therapist in 4 weeks. My team will bridge you. We'll see you every single week for the next 4 weeks until you're able to get to your regular therapist, and other creative situations. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, but people have been very creative across the board. I hear my colleagues making all kinds of really interesting out of the box thinking as to how to address the needs of the people in their communities. And it's very exciting.
I want to add a few points to that, Bill, because I think when you do work in emergency crisis work, I think a lot of it goes against everything you learned in your master's program of how treatment should be conducted, how confidentiality should be happening, how interactions with people. I remember the issue about the boarding is going into the ER and saying, I need to have a private room to talk to this person in, and believing that that's one of the basis piece of doing any type of interaction in a clinical way or a professional way is that I need to have confidentiality. I need to give this person dignity. I need to do this. But meanwhile, the reality is there's 5 boarders sitting on beds in the hallways, and I have to do an assessment with 5 people around us. And that was tough to do professionally, but also just logistically, that's a tough one. And when someone is in the hospital for the psych issues, to your point, is that's all consuming for those medical professionals. You have to have security. You have to have constant connection with calling the emergency services team and finding out when they're going to be there, doing the tox levels, the tox screens, the blood alcohol level, doing constant medication if someone is going into withdrawing or detoxing. There's all those things plus the medical piece as well. So that's when we have that. I'm just referring to when we used to work at Metro West Medical Center, Framingham. There was just one corner that used to be the psych part. We had kind of like a little closed off area. And then we had like a closet that we could do our assessment in. And there's like 3 to 4 of us sitting in there making phone calls, consulting, things like that. But it's almost laughable that this important issue is still not given the space they need, not given the money they need, not having a place for people to go, because it does feel almost endless when you know this person needs, I don't know, a certain level of psychiatric care, and you really can't refer them anywhere. If there's no beds in the whole state, it feels very impotent. You feel, that's a stressor that I'm sure you and your staff feel all the time. And I can't imagine what it's like now, because we felt it 5 to 10 years ago.
Right. And I think that that's kind of something that if I was someone, and I know we're not doing an infomercial by any stretch here, but if I was someone listening to this, I'm like, I'm 24. I wonder if I want to go to ES. I think we're doing a really piss poor job on selling it. That's just my view.
It's the best time in my life.
Right. So I think that for me,
Professionally.
we barely touched on it. And I think it might be important because I honestly, from the bottom of my heart, and I think now I can finally look at a camera and say, probably the best time of my life. I really, truly enjoyed my work. No jokes. I learned that I didn't want to work with this population,
Yes.
and this population, which I had no interest whatsoever, suddenly became a population I work with. So for me, I want to be able to, I make no money, people going to ES or not. That's not the point. But for me, it's like we said earlier, we tell people go do ES work for maybe a year or two in order to really figure out some stuff. So maybe it might be important for us to kind of like discuss out loud, why would someone do ES work? What are they going to discover? Why do they want to eat spaghetti next to the bathroom in an emergency room instead of something else?
Well, if you like smelling shit on the walls and their piss poor attempt to put coffee grinds in a little bedpan next to, the bed to try to, mitigate the smell, and you could still eat a pizza, then they're in for it. But seriously.
But I hear that if you spread feces on the wall, there's a psychiatrist I can say off the top of my head will give you a section 12 in 2 seconds.
I know exactly who you're talking about. And then some won't. So think about that as your perspective changes when you're in the, you're within this department is what regular people would think is an emergency or a horrible situation is almost the norm. So you do have a different perspective. But I think the best part of that was I loved going in and having a case that would include talking to the police, I love that part of the investigatory piece of it. So you had to deal with lots of different professions. You had to do things very quickly, which I found very exciting. There was never a dull moment. Even if some of the cases tend to be similar in some ways, none of the days were ever the same. I loved my colleagues, obviously. We always had a good time because we did have a lot of things in common, and we did try to support each other in this times. The professionalism that you gain is outstanding because you learn so much. I remember going into my master's program, and so many people had just gone from their bachelor's right into their master's and had never worked in the real world. And I thought, you're missing out because some of these things you want to implement, like I went to Leslie, so there was a lot of expressive arts and things like that. And I said, how would you do that while someone's urinating in the corner while you're trying to talk to them? I'd think about all these things, but the real life experience kind of with the professionalism and the knowledge that we do have melded in a really, almost a perfect way. So you learned a lot, but you were right in the action. You were doing everything that you needed to do, and not only to talk to the insurance companies, that's a tough job in itself, but doing bed search. So you're connecting with people that are intake workers. You're then talking to the nursing staff at all the different hospitals in the whole state. That's pretty impressive.
I would definitely agree with that. I think Cara hit on a really good reason to do ES, aside from the clinical experience, because you're going to see every diagnosis in the DSM-5 walk through your door probably in about 2 years, and probably see it multiple times. And it's very different reading about somebody with a psychotic disorder versus having somebody with a psychotic disorder sitting in front of you. How do you engage them in a meaningful way? Because that's really the key of what we're doing. How do I engage this person in a meaningful way? I don't have 3 or 4 sessions to develop rapport with this individual. I've got about 10 minutes, if that. Probably closer to 5, because if I can't develop rapport, they're just going to tell me to fuck off and get out.
Have you ever heard anybody say that to you, Steve or Bill?
About what? Tell me to fuck off. I have a board in my office about it. That's how often
remember
that
the good old days. But
and
that doesn't phase us, and that didn't phase us. So you didn't hurt my feelings. You didn't make me feel less as a
Yeah.
clinician. I reveled in it. I would say, this is more of a challenge, or I'll use this humor or this irony to develop this rapport, like you're saying.
And I think, and it's important to remember that that's one aspect, because right after you have that conversation, you need to go to a doctor and have the same content, but a different way of talking about it.
Yes.
Which then translates into the same content, but a different way of talking about it to the insurance company. You really develop the skills of, how do I talk to other professionals in a way, how can I relate to this person who's having this emergency right here and now, where I need to be relatable. And 5 minutes later, I need to have this conversation with other professionals that I need to, in some ways, ease their anxiety, that I know what I'm talking about and have developed an effective plan. And I can communicate that in a professional manner, regardless of what just went on in the exam room. Or, as I said, where our big focus is on community now. I mean, it could be what just happened in this person's house that I now need to communicate to another professional. Because a lot of times that's what it really is, especially talking to doctors. It's managing their anxiety about the case, because what the doctors don't usually admit to is they're looking to us as the experts.
How many times we've gone into the ER and they say, what do you want to do? And I'm thinking, me? Okay, well, here we go. This is what we want to do. And to your point, you do have to have that ability to switch. So you're talking in rapport building, communication to whatever the person is presenting at. So you have to be very flexible. You have to have different styles. We see kids from 0, and we see all the way up to 100-year-olds. So you have to be ready to see a 5-year-old kid talk to their parents, do the assessment, call their teacher. Then, like you said, present in a clinical manner, which is a lot of diagnostic terms and using some, assessment, and really utilizing your knowledge of kind of that book stuff that we learned, so that you can present it so that person will accept it and agree to your plan, or at least be able to consult with you on that. And then we also have to transcribe it, because I know you created this software, but in the olden days, we had to write everything down, and it was 12. I remember 12 pages. And there was paragraphs we had to write. There was, yes, there were check marks, but you had to have documentation for everything that you were saying.
Right.
So it had to be able to be proved. You can't just say someone uses cocaine 3 times a week. This person has used it. This is the history. This is the consequences to this. This is the surrounding triggers and kind of the environment that person's in. So there was a lot more that you have to assess.
Yeah. Right. And I think that a couple of things that I want to come back to is doctors turning to us. And that's always been kind of like a weird one for me at the beginning. And then you get used to it. And it's almost at one point you get so used to it, so that if a doctor challenges what your outcome is going to be, or what you desire as an outcome or recommendation, it's almost like, wait a minute, what? The other guy was asking me whatever I wanted to do.
Right.
So I think that helps to learn to be more critical about your clinical work and how you're going to make decisions. So I think that that's a good thing for me, even though it sometimes turns you off either way. It's something that you got to learn. One of the things that I think I think I read both of you saying this, but I'll say it in a different way, is that you learn to de-escalate a situation significantly better in an emergency service than any other job you'll ever have. Because one of the things that I remember my first supervisor at the job said, if someone has psychosis and they tell you and again, we're not making fun of psychosis, but if they say there's little blue people coming to their room and telling them what to do, you can't challenge that. You got to say, what are they saying? How many are there? And so you get to a point where the person feels like almost acknowledged and validated, despite possibly being in psychosis, and being able to make a better judgment. Is this hospital level of care? Is this outpatient? Is it partial hospitalization? Everywhere in between, obviously. But I think that that's one of the things that I've really also appreciated learning from. You don't learn that in your internship, but you'll learn that at an emergency service.
Yeah, to that point, I think we talked about this in the first podcast, that brings to mind, if someone doesn't speak English as their first language, if someone is deaf, asking, can you hear voices in your head? And then I'm like, wait, that I can't ask this question to a deaf person because that doesn't make sense. So then kind of adjusting it to what the client is presenting as, and there's cultural differences, there's gender differences, there's the substance use issues, history of trauma. So there's so many aspects you really have to consider. I remember doing an assessment where the client was Hispanic, and they were presenting with saying psychosis. But when I did the evaluation with a translator or an interpreter, coming to kind of assess that this was more about a faith experience of seeing or hearing someone. So that was very different. You don't hospitalize someone for having a conversation with their grandmother who died 3 years ago, or whatever that is. You have to assess it and figure out which is which, but that's an aspect of it that you really have to be nuanced enough to assess.
And I think, again, not to put too fine of a point on it, but I think what you're both saying is in ES, the primary job is to de-escalate. However, we need to keep in mind that it's to de-escalate the individual we're working with, but very possibly you need to de-escalate the hospital staff, the residential staff, the insurance staff. We have to be able to build confidence in all of those people so that we can get a really clear picture as to what's going on and make sure that we're basing our decisions, our plans, whatever, on actual clinical information versus someone, whether it's the client or one of their providers, emotional state.
Right. Or agenda.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes they have agendas too. You're right.
And that's another thing, and maybe that's the segue for Steve, having to have boundaries as clinicians and how you develop that, because I absolutely, and Steve and Bill, you probably do it differently, but there was no training on that at all. I think my first day, nobody talked to me the whole day, and I didn't even know how to make copies. And I was in the ER right away, already in those days, we had stickers, we had to put a sticker on each page that we did, those 12 pages of evaluations, the stickers with the client's information. Then you had to have the medical issues. So I remember that, and there was and there's also things that we talked about before about gender. Me going into a room with a man who might have a predatory history, that's a different experience, and it's hard to be scared or uncomfortable and do a proper assessment. So that is really difficult. So you have to also be safe. You also have to be monitoring your own reactions and your projections and all those things too.
Oh, you're saying stickers. I remember when we had to go to a machine and go clink, clink, clink.
I do remember those.
I'm like, that would be my first thing to do. You got the 12
stamp,
pages.
That stamp, right? Oh my gosh. And then the
find
stickers.
that little blue card?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. That was always on a paper clip on the front. You are jogging my memory.
But no, I think that it's a good segue to talk about self-care, because for me, self-care wasn't something that really occurred at the beginning of emergency service work for me. The first thing was, take a few phone calls. All right, you're good. It's an overnight. It's a Friday night. You're good. What do you mean you're good? You're good. You answered 3 phone calls. You did great.
Training
all right. That's awesome.
This is it.
That was your training, Steve. But the one lesson that I remember that I truly also respect from one of my supervisors, it said, like, if you have personal issues when you get to work, you take the backpack of personal issues, you leave it at the door. Once you get into this office, you pick up the work office backpack, you put it back on your shoulder, and you go in and deal with that. And when you're done with your day of work, you take your backpack, put it down, pick up your personal stuff, and you put it over on your shoulder again. And it was a good way to kind of set, it wasn't called boundaries. Obviously, now we use better language. But for me, it was a good way to think about boundaries in regards to, like, when you're in your personal life, you don't carry your work stuff with you. But I don't know if we give enough, we call it self-care, whether it's teaching people how to do self-care, but more importantly, having agencies support self-care. And I don't know about what happens today, Bill, and what your points of views are, but I would love to hear more about how do we encourage people to do ES, which is hard work, but we also joke about because we liked it. And we certainly would go back for it for a significant amount more money just before you ask Bill again. At the end of the day, though, it's what can we do about self-care so that people can get in this work and actually last for like us, like what, 61 years combined?
And we're only
Yeah,
20 years old each.
I wish. What can we do for self-care? Well, I mean, a lot of it, I think, is kind of what you said, having some good boundaries. I think we used to call it compartmentalizing. I can
Right.
compartmentalize what I do at work versus what I do at home. Unfortunately, because of the work we do, sometimes it spills over. And when that's happening, you need to know when you need a break. And everybody has different self-care things that they do. I know I work with one clinician. She likes to go get a massage. Personally, I've always used meditation. I've done a lot of meditation for my own self-care, but other people will go for hikes, they'll go canoeing, they'll go camping, they'll do something to get themselves out of the mindset. One of the things that recently occurred to me is we do a lot of talk about self-care, and I don't want to be misunderstood. Self-care is very important, but you don't have to do self-care alone. And I
Mm,
think that's the part that gets missed is, especially if you're going to do this kind of work, talk to your colleagues, do things with your colleagues that's not related to emergency services. That's going to help you develop healthy coping mechanisms. It's also going to, lead you to some pretty good friendships, kind of like what we have here on screen. But
Yes.
because the people who do emergency services, especially who would do it for any significant length of time, we actually become our own community. Because unless you've done the work, you're never going to truly understand the work. I do make this comparison between the emergency service workers, the first responders, military. It's not exact parallels, but there are some aspects of it that are very, very similar. That unless you've been us, you don't know us.
mm.
Though I encourage everybody to try it because the benefits, I think, certainly outweigh some of the struggles that you may have, you know. But I think that's an important aspect of the self-care too, is that self-care doesn't mean you have to do it on your own.
Mm.
You should be working with your colleagues and having them support you and you supporting them when necessary.
Yeah, it does make a difference if someone is role modeling, a supervisor is role modeling their own self-care or community self-care, like you're talking about in the environment and the culture of the department that you're in, because there's no way that people would not have a problem with some of the things that you have to see, maybe processing them or seeing people in their maybe their worst day. That's a really tough thing to have to do. And then to go home and not be able to really talk to anybody about it, not only to confidentiality, but like you said, you can't really explain to someone who's an engineer what you saw at the ER,
Yeah.
and they'd be horrified by some of the things. And you're like, well, that's not what I'm horrified by. This is the other aspect that I'm kind of
Right.
is more upsetting, because you see it
Yeah.
differently.
You definitely see it differently.
It-
Like you said, you could tell them the story and exactly, they're like, oh my God, that must have been hard. It's like, no, the hard part was dealing with the insurance company.
Right, right.
That
That part
that that
was
part's what
fine.
frustrated me because the damn person just wouldn't listen, or the doctor
Right.
disagreed
Right.
with me, or whatever. It's like it's funny that those are the things that end up bothering you when you would think it would be the story the person told. It's like, no, that I can handle, you know.
Right.
But it is interesting. It's interesting what may bother one person doesn't bother the other.
And that's a good point too, is knowing your strengths, because if you are the best one able to deal with younger kids versus, I was called in a lot of times for working with the elderly, which I feel like that was a passion of mine, but also I felt very knowledgeable about working with elders and seniors and some of those aspects. I felt like that was kind of a niche that I had a strength in. So, when you say like, Bill or Cara, do you want to take this case? I would say, well, if it's an older person, I'll take that one. Or Bill, you would see, a teenager or a younger child.
Right. And I think it's all important stuff to remember. I mean, to me, with the self care, is that I remember at one point when I was working for the ES team, I got a call on a Sunday and they're like, Steve, I know you're not on call, but we have a firefighter in the emergency room and we need someone who will get it. So it wasn't about saying anything bad about our colleagues, but that was kind of my strength, my forte. And I think sometimes it's good to think about that. we have someone who is elderly, who may have started early onset dementia or any dementia for that matter. I may not be the right person for that and might be more Cara. And, Bill really finds a way to relate to a whole lot of people that a lot of people find very hard to relate to. And Bill's really good at that. It's finding those strengths and knowing your team enough, but also knowing that if it's just you, you do it and then go, hey, Bill, when you have a chance, this is what I was going to try to like this. One of the things I've learned in the last year is that when you're having a hard time, don't sit there and say, I'm having a hard time. No, call Cara, call Bill. Well, maybe not you. I'm talking for me. But call someone you trust that will listen to you. And if you're saying like, I was thinking this, but this happened and it really bothered me that the nurse did this. And all of you will nod like exactly what I'm talking about. Oh yeah. You talk to someone who's not working in our field, they're going to be, you were pissed by the nurse. Oh, you're missing the point here.
Right.
So reaching out to people who get it is also very important.
Yeah. Because it is a unique experience. And there are a lot of positives, and we all kind of have you can see us light up, but when we talk about it still, that there was some excitement that we loved about it. We loved, showing our skills and always having something that might test us. And we kind of looked forward to that. It was fun. It was exciting. You have to have a certain type of personality to like crisis because it is very unique.
Let's face it feeds our egos too a little bit. Because think about it. When you're working emergency services, what do? You get the cases that nobody else knows how to figure out. Nobody else knows how to handle or help this person. And you don't have anyone to refer them to. It's you. You figure out how to best help this person. And again, the solutions you come up with may not necessarily be the long-term solution, because we usually think in terms of 24 hours. What can I do to help this person within the next 24 hours? Which, going back to our quirks, probably is one of the reasons why I'm a very impatient person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't wait well.
Right.
I want things done immediately. But I do think it's one of the things that can give us confidence as a therapist. Think about it. The two of you have done emergency services for a long time. I know you have your specialties when it comes to doing the private practice therapy, but in all seriousness, is there anyone who's going to sit across from you that you won't be able to find some way to help? It may be that, you need to refer them out to somebody else, but you're at least going to be able to address their immediate need.
Right. I agree with that, Bill, because I remember when I first was thinking about the practice and, to niche or not to niche and your specialties are, and everything I looked at, I said, well, I could do that. I know I could do that. Do I want to, or, is that kind of part of my business plan? What do I want to do? But I knew in every situation I could do that because I've seen that and I've worked with all different types of populations. And I have that experience and that knowledge that, again, you don't get from a book.
Right.
I think that Bill called us egomaniacs, but that's just my opinion. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, by the way, because there is something about the work that we've done that just feels right for us. And one of the things that I would just coming back a little bit about those who want to do ES and why they should do it. There's not a day I don't walk into my private practice outpatient service that I sit on my butt and deal with people's past issues or what have you and go, this is so much easier than sending in an ER and figuring out what's going on, how to create this. Also, how are we going to get the right outcome for this particular, like that's a lot. And like we did it, in 3 hours.
Right.
Now I'm sitting across from someone for 45 minutes to an hour and going, I don't even have to figure out the outcome. The outcome is I'll see you in 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever.
Yeah,
There's something about that that's grateful. Like created a lot of gratefulness.
Yes. I totally, that's a really good point, Steve, is when you're thinking, and then that's something I've struggled with in the private practice of every session trying to think that I have to do something or fix something or make sure I provide them with a resource that will be something that they can leave with. And that was like simmer down, Cara, like it doesn't have to be. This is part of when my husband said, am I supposed to just listen or give you ideas? I'm like, just listen, and just that learning to just sit with that feeling and just saying, I can have that shared empathy, that compassion, teach you different strategies, but I can't fix it, and that's okay. And that's part of why therapy is different from crisis work.
Absolutely. I know when I first started in private practice, I was like, oh, you came back. Was I unclear what you should do last time?
You should be fixed. What's going on?
Why are you back? I don't understand.
Right.
I remember a conversation when you started private practice. We had a conversation about that because someone had come in with a specific acute issue. I'm going to talk generally here. And you're like, well, I took care of the acute issue, Steve. What do I do for the next few weeks? You talk to them. You think that's the only issue they have? What do you mean? Like, I took care of the issue, Bill. They didn't just show up with an issue. There was probably a history behind that.
Right.
I told them what to do. What's
right?
I don't know if you remember that conversation.
I do.
Yeah, and to try to sit with that feeling that some of the rapport building, especially with the teen clients that I see, is just as important as giving a solution, is that so that building that rapport, building that relationship, so that when they do have something to say, you're there for them because they know next week. And then they'll come out of the blue from these teens and you're like, wait, they're telling me something so intimate or so important. I'm the only adult they've ever talked to about this. That playing Jenga or, Uno or beating them at all those games was important because I don't let them win. But I think that was like, it still was important in validating them. And all of us, Steve, you're on the cusp, but Bill and I are, veterans of having teens at this point, and they're a hard nut to crack. My kids don't talk to me, but these kids I see in private practice, I'm a different, a parent is different from a therapist. So there's where you have that advantage.
Yeah, I'll be consulting with you and you guys for that one. But the problem is you guys had boys. I have girls.
Yeah, it is. It's tough either way. It's tough.
Yeah. I have one right now. They're like, well, I can't talk to you. You don't understand me. I'm like, I talk to teenagers for a living.
I'm literally went to school for this. Okay. Yes. You don't know anything.
I have an advanced degree in interpersonal communication.
What do you know, Bill?
Right. Yeah. Practice is all 18 to 22-year-olds. I
Right. Oh, God.
But I think it's already been an hour, so we got to kind of wrap up here. And if there's anything, I know we started off with the plugs, but is there anything you wanted to add that, for people to reach you? For me, I think about people who might want to know more about ES work, particularly Bill, what you're doing now. And Cara, your work with, for me, the stuff that really fascinates me is your work with the elderly, but also pandas, which is something that's not well known. So if you guys want to speak to any of those things or none of that, it's fine with me too. But
sure. And again, to niche or not to niche, I thought about, I said to Steve when I was first, I said, well, I can't do this. I don't know enough about one thing. And he's like, are you kidding me? Remember all this experience, remember the work you've done in the school system for Tourette's or pandas. And I started to be like, okay, wait a second. I do have some strengths and, maybe some things I'd prefer. I've ran a caregiver support group. I've worked with dementia patients. I have an Alzheimer training. I've worked at several nursing homes, senior centers, elder protective services. So I do have that strength, along with the pandas that you mentioned, which is pediatric autoimmune neurological disorder. So it's very interesting, like you said, because it's not always accepted in all the medical fields. So if you have some knowledge about Tourette's, which is a neurological disorder, there is a connection there with that. And sometimes kids who have strep throat or some sort of infection, it ends up escalating some of their response. There's a lot more information, and it's neurological, but basically some of the responses end up being maybe some obsessive OCD, obsessive compulsive type of behaviors, some self-harm type of behaviors, or some behavioral issues. And it's really a hard, difficult, and complex disorder to understand, especially in the school systems, which expect kids to just sit down and not move or talk during instruction or curriculum. So it's really a place where knowledge is needed, education is needed, and that support in the medical field, but also the psychiatric field. So again, that's something I'm drawn to. I have a personal relationship with that and a professional relationship. So I have some compassion and empathy for parents trying to parent children who are experiencing that, but especially a kid trying to manage that as well.
Thank you, Karen. And definitely, hopefully you'll get those referrals and more. So thank you for that.
Thank
Bill?
I'm still doing emergency services. So if anybody wants any information on that, feel free to contact me through my website. Anybody who has any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. That's fine. Private practice, as Steve taught me a long time ago, apparently I'm very good at solution-focused therapy and brief therapy, and been working a lot with older teens and those who are kind of transitioning out of college into the adult world, as well as anxiety and so forth. I'm really drawn to like mindfulness practices and the use of meditation, as I had commented before. So if you're into stuff like that, hit me up. Happy to talk to you about it.
That's great, Bill. 'Cause I love the mindfulness. I've really started to work with that. I really love that. And it's so important. And really starting to talk about self-compassion. I try to practice it myself, but as an Irish Catholic woman, it is very hard thinking about, having compassion for yourself, because I always think about, would you talk this way to a friend? No, you wouldn't be such a hard ass. Basically, You'd be really compassionate and mindful and giving them a pass and, saying that's okay. All those things that you would do for a friend, trying to turn that in on yourself.
Yep, absolutely. It's very, very difficult and very needed.
Yes.
It might be something that we can discuss off air or even in the next podcast if you want to come back. But how that mindfulness and meditation and other practices like that helps you ground yourself, especially in the ES work, but also in general, and how that could help individuals to do that good self-care during ES work. But just a thought.
Sure.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I can do that.
I thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you, I'm sure, soon.
Yes.
See you later. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that concludes episode 55 with Cara, Tirrell, and Bill Dwinnells. Thank you so much again for the great conversation. Really enjoyed it. I hope that you enjoyed it too. Next episode will be with Lisa Dennis, who will be talking about spirituality also. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation. I know we talked about wrestling a few seasons ago, but looking forward to our conversation in the next episode. Please like, subscribe, or follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for information, educational, and entertainment purposes. If you are struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor or therapist for consultation.